Hi, this is Nisha, and this is part 2 in our history of the AK. I want to make one correction. On part 1, I realized what I said after the fact. That's the problem about videos, you can't go back and edit yourself. I said that 10 million AKs were made. The number was actually 5 million. Apologies for that. I was mixing up with the AKM here, which we're getting into today. In part 1, we talked about the pros and the cons of the original AK Type 3, which was produced in about half a dozen different countries and used by several dozen in the mid to late 50s. However, weight was its major drawback. Accuracy wasn't great either, especially in full auto, but weight was its major drawback. In Russia in the mid 50s, a design known as the Korobov TBK 517 was tested. It was not an AK. And while it was never adopted, it was much lighter and gave better accuracy than the AK Type 3 that was in production at the time. This got the Soviet government thinking. In 1955, they kind of laid out requirements for a replacement to the original AK, known often as the AK-47. Either way, the one with the milled receiver. The idea was simple. Lighter, cheaper, faster to produce, and hopefully a little more accurate, maybe a little more ergonomic. Just kind of correcting some of the deficiencies. 1957, 1958, several rounds of trials were held. If you've noticed, Russia likes to do several rounds of trials. And 3 main companies put in designs really done by teams at each company. We had Izhevsk, the producer of the Kalashnikov, with a team headed by Kalashnikov. We had the Tula arsenal, and we have the Kovrov arsenal. They each submitted designs. And while the competition had some benefits over the Kalashnikov design, in the end, the Kalashnikov was selected in 1959. The reasons were pretty straightforward. They already pretty much were set up to make it. Soldiers were already familiar with how to use it, maintain it, clean it. Armorers were already familiar with basically how to keep it running, so on and so forth. Familiarity and all that. Now, another part of the request that was put out is they wanted to have a family. They wanted to have both a assault rifle and light machine gun, basically the same gun, but one with a longer, heavier barrel and increased magazine capacity. Up until this point, remember, we're using the AK for our assault rifle, and we're using the RPD, which is an unrelated design, although still in the 7.62x39 caliber, as our light machine gun, and it's belt fed. This would lead to the RPK, which is for another video, but that's where the RPK's genesis, it got started. It was basically a parallel development with the AKM. The AKM, the automatic Kalashnikov modernized or improved, depending on how you want to translate the word, as I said, was adopted in 1959. And it was exactly what Russia wanted. It was lighter, cheaper, faster to produce. Now, this one I'm holding here is an Egyptian-made ARM produced at the Mahdi factory, Factory 54 in Egypt, as I said. And it is an exact copy of a 60s era Russian AKM. In fact, when I picked up this rifle last year, I sold my AKM kit build, which was an Izhevsk 1971, because this thing is a factory built gun and it has all the features of the AKM. What they did, the gun's basically the same gun, but the parts are almost all different. We have a 16-inch chrome line barrel still. We're still threaded 14mm. Now, we replaced the muzzle nut, which was originally, the barrel was just threaded for a blank fire device, perhaps a grenade launcher. Now we replace it as standard with this so-called sugar scoop, which was designed to adjust for recoil, especially in full auto. It is asymmetrical. It is designed to push the muzzle down into the left to counteract the projectile coming out, spinning to the right and forward. The bayonet lug is deleted under the front sight. Now we just have a retainer for the head of the cleaning rod. The bayonet lug would be here on an AKM, but since this is an import, it was shaved off, although the stud for it's still here. There just need to be wings here, and it takes a new pattern of bayonet. The barrel is lighter, especially as you get further back, so the gas block is different. It's still a 45-degree machined gas block. We've moved the vent holes on the gas tube here to the gas block now, though. They run around it. The idea was you build up gas pressure here getting onto your piston head, but once the head's out of the gas tube, this lets pressure off, so it's basically a self-regulating system. The upper handguard is the same. Now they would go to laminated birch wood in Russia and many countries, including Egypt, to copy this. The lower handguard has a different contour. We have palm swells for better gripping and control, especially again in full auto. The sling swivel has been located from the gas block to the handguard retainer. And this is interesting to me because on the original Type 1 AK, the original stamped receiver, this is where your handguard, your sling swivel was. That's kind of interesting. The rear sight was changed. The original AK was good out to 800 meters. The AKM goes out to 1,000, which is ridiculous, either one, but oh well. The spring-loaded button was moved from the left side here to the right side on the AKM. So the rear sights are quite different. The dust cover was made of thinner gauge steel, and it was given both horizontal and vertical ribs for strength. The buttstock, it lost a lot of its sweep. The original AK, the buttstock swept down, kind of like on a Thompson. This is more inline, more straight. Also, it has the rear sling swivel on its bottom now. We do retain the trapdoor in the buttstock for a cleaning kit. The pistol grip has gone from wood to a Bakelite type material. This is Egyptian, as I said, but the Russians also used a brown style. The only real difference, this has concave checkering, the Russians have convex, but color is very similar. The magazines we'll get to in a minute. The bolt carrier and bolt were both given lightning cuts. You can see the step here. That was to lighten up the bolt a bit. Also, we went from having the bolt group polished silver, polished steel, to finished out to better protect it from corrosion. The Russian AKM would have a parkerized finish, and over that would have a paint type finish, and the Egyptian guns would have the same. And the biggest difference, of course, is this receiver. We're now going back to a stamped receiver like the original AK Type 1. Now the receiver is made differently. This is thinner gauge. We use riveting more than welding to hold things together. The barrel fits into a front machined trunnion, which is in turn riveted to this receiver, and it is pressed in and then pinned in place. This was faster, easier to do, especially for head spacing. Just press it into the appropriate depth and then pin it there. And the rear trunnion is very different from on an AK. We have a short top tang with one screw here, and we have an internal screw in the receiver here under the recoil spring. And we have no bottom tang. And this rear trunnion is also machined, even though the receiver is stamped. Because the trunnions take all the force, about all that's left for the receiver to soak up is where the rivets are at. So if the receiver is properly heat treated and hardened around the rivets, and if the rivets themselves are properly installed and staked in there, you're good to go. Now, the trigger was also changed. It went from a double hook pattern based on kind of the Garand in the original AK to a single hook. This is, of course, a semi-auto, so it won't have this. But they would also add what many call a rate reducer with the AKM. It did slow the rate of fire from about 650 down to 600 rounds per minute in the AKM versus the AK. But its major addition and point was it was an out-of-battery safety. Essentially, it would not let the hammer go forward and hit the bolt until the bolt was fully locked into the front trunnion. So it was more of a safety feature. So yes, because the ATF mandates that we don't have that piece in our AKs, they're just that little bit less safe. This gun is significantly lighter than the AK. It is over 2 pounds lighter, nearly between 2 and 2.5 pounds, depending on the exact variant and wood and all that stuff, but around a kilogram lighter. Lengthwise, we're still at about 34.25 inches. Well, now we take that back. We are a little longer if we have this on, so we're more at 35 inches. So a smidge longer if you have the sugar scoop. Not all AKMs that were made would have these. And of course, since they screw on, you can add them or not. But the barrel length's the same. Other dimensions are basically the same. A lot of AK and AKM parts will interchange, but they're not the same. So if I put in an AK bolt group in here, it would probably fit, assuming headspace worked out. But it wouldn't be the right part, you could tell. Now that said, a lot of countries would kind of mix and match as these would be produced outside of Russia. I'm just using this Egyptian gun as it's a great example of a factory-built AKM and probably the closest we've had offered in the country if you want a factory-built. Now we have more of an import history on all this. This isn't about the semi-autos. We have videos on those. But these are going to production around 1959, 1960 in Russia at Izhevsk and Tula. And they would produce these in large numbers until the late 70s. Some places say 1977, some places say 1979. You get the idea. We're still firing the 7.6239 M43 cartridge as the original AK. All that's the same. And we're still using the same mags in a sense. They're at least interchangeable. Now, there was kind of a thing with mags. This, as you can tell, is the standard ribbed mag. It also has the paint over part finish. It's about 20% lighter, or 3/4 lighter. It's 3/4 of a pound versus the original mag being 1 pound. So it's about 20% lighter, 25% lighter in that range. Compared to the original stamped mag, it's made out of thinner steel, but they put the ribbing for strength. And this is what was ultimately adopted. It was designed at Tula because the whole idea was to save weight, and that's what was adopted. However, there was another pattern of mag that was competing against it from Izhevsk, and this is the so-called waffle alloy mag. It is not made of steel. It is made of alloy, an aluminium type, and it is 1/2 pound, so it's half as light as the original mag. So extremely light, which is good. But it wasn't durable enough. So they made these, they tested both. They eventually just went with the more durable, if also a little bit still heavier, ribbed pattern that we know today. So when you find alloys, they're kind of interesting because not that many were made compared to the standard. But they were trying to save on weight. And you know, when you load a soldier out with anywhere from 3 to 5 mags, saving a 1/4 pound, 1/2 pound on each mag is a significant savings. Plus your gun itself is a whole kilogram lighter. The AKM is what most of us are familiar with. This is the gun that was really exported around the world. 45, 50 nations officially used it. More would unofficially use it. It would be made in about a dozen nations. They would produce about 10,200,000 in Russia, with many more made elsewhere. Some variations were very close to this, others were very far away. The people would take this design and kind of run with it. All your users of the AK would also go to the AKM to some extent. China was interesting. They had the Type 56 milled gun, as we said in video 1. By the 60s, when the AKM was getting prevalent, Russia and China weren't on good terms. So what China did for the Type 56 with their stamped receiver, they basically retrofitted the original AK Type 3, kept keeping most of its features, but going to a slightly heavier, thick stamped receiver. Now this is 1mm. The Chinese Type 56 with the stamped receiver would have a 1.5, 1.6 mil. And it would retain a lot of the AK Type 3 features. Poland would also start manufacturing the AKM around 1966, calling it either just simply the AKM or the PM-K, and it would be a basically exact copy of the Russian gun. We'll look at one here in just a minute. And they would make the fixed stock AKM for about 10 years. I've seen numbers anywhere from them in Poland at the Radom factory discontinuing manufacturing 1972 up to about 1978. Kind of hard to say, but they made it until the 70s. Romania would also produce a pretty dang exact copy of the Russian AKM. If you recall, it would never make the AK at the Cougar arsenal, though they would purchase some from Izhevsk. But it would purchase the rights to manufacture the AKM in country, and it would adopt it as the PM63. The gun I'm holding here is my trusty old Romanian SAR-1, my first AK, and still one of my absolute favorites. These are imported. They are pretty much exact copies of a later production AKM from Romania, just made semi-auto. The PM63 would originally be pretty much the exact same gun. Now, like the Egyptian one, it would have a bayonet lug here if it was an import. These also did not come in with threaded barrels, although I've had this one threaded and added the sugar scoop. The original guns would have the palm swell handguard, but a short time later, they would go to this, what many called today in America, the Donkey Dong, or Donkey Kong handguard for foregripping. And this would become very standard throughout the Romanian military, beginning in the late 60s and running well through today. That's really the only major change that Romania did. Otherwise, everything else is a pretty exact copy. The furniture, as wood is wont to do, can vary it a little bit, but I believe Romania also used some hardwood, but they definitely used laminated as well. They would also copy the rib pattern magazine. This one does have the scope rail on the side. In Russia, they didn't produce a heck of a lot of AKMs with the rail, but when they did, they called it the AKM-N. They would also produce a version in Russia that was used in Poland and perhaps produced in Poland in small numbers called the AKM-L, which is a night fighting rig. It would come with a night fighting scope, a folding light bipod that clipped onto the barrel here, and a long birdcage flash hider to protect the night vision scope from the muzzle's flash. The AKM-L is pretty rare in the US, but it's an interesting gun. Century made a few semi-autos that they called AKM-Ls a few years ago, and while they were using original Polish parts, they built them on milled receivers, which is just weird and wrong. There were a lot of variations of these, of the AKM, but they were mostly small. I don't have time or the desire to go into every nation's variations in this video, I'm sorry. You can check out our other ones. We do go into a little more in there. Hungary would also produce a version. It would be originally called the AKM 63 as well. It also made at the FEG factory. It would be just like all other AKMs in the beginning, 16-inch barrel. but instead of having wooden handguard, it would have a simple gas tube up here, a metal grill down here, and a vertical grip made of wood, and a vertical grip made of wood back here, and a fixed wood stock. If you've seen an AMD 65, which was the carbine version, it had the same handguard set up, but instead of having the folding stock, it had the wood. Also, the AMD has a slightly shorter gas system. Later, Hungary would go to the AK-63 series, which was, again, not exactly a copy of the AKM. It combined the AKM with some AK features. They would make it as the AK-63F for fixed stock, or AK-63D for underfolding stock. And we have some videos featuring my SA-85M, which is a semi-auto import from the 80s that was based on that, so check those out. Bulgaria, interestingly, would kind of keep on with the milled receiver, even though they would adopt a lot of the AKM features, such as the lighter barrel and having it pressed and pinned in as time would go on. But they would kind of stick to the milled AKM 7.62x39, which is quite interesting. They would go to the stamped with the AK-74 line, but that's a story for another day. Czechoslovakia would make the VZ-58, which has really nothing to do with these guns, so that's neither here nor there. There would be some North Korean copies of both the AK and the AKM, but very little is known about them. I've never handled one, so I don't want to speak to them in this video. And Finland again did its own thing with the Valmet and later Seiko series, which is really inspired by the AK but quite different, and I don't want to squeeze it into this video as well. I'm just trying to cover the basics. The AKM and its derivatives were just what was produced for a really long time, and still in some cases today. Romania, in fact, would do a version of this. Remember, this is called the PM63 in the military circle, called the PM90 in 1990, and it was essentially this exact same gun, except with a side folding wire stock. So they would keep using it. They're still in service today, although they have mostly switched over to the 545. And that's kind of where it's at in Russia too. Even though the AK-74 and its new cartridge was adopted in Russia, the AKM was never officially declared obsolete. So there are still limited numbers in Russian service today, as well as other nations. In fact, it's still standard in Hungary. As for Yugoslavia, today Serbia, we looked at the M70 milled gun in the first video. This is my Zastava OPAP M70. It's pretty dang close to what Yugoslavia would use. They would go with a version called the M70B1, which was a switch from the milled receiver to a 1.5 mil stamped with a thicker front trunnion. And this, kind of like with the Chinese guns, would have a lot of leftover AK features. We still retain the heavy barrel. We have moved the vent ports on the gas tube to the gas block, like on an AKM though. The grenade sights are still here, but the base is a little bit different. The top cover now has the horizontal depression rib here, although it's still smooth topped versus the AKM style. The buttstock and this retaining latch are identical. This one has a rail, most of them didn't, so just, yeah. The pistol grip was changed a little bit. The metal ferrule on the AK-70 or AK-64 and early AK-70s was deleted, although the grip itself is still very similar. And we're still using the bolt hold open pattern magazines and the long handguards. So this is an example of one of the guns that was a combination of AK and AKM features. It does have the lightning cut bolt and carrier as well. It's kind of interesting. These are still in service today, although they're being phased out by more modern guns finally, and quite a few saw use during the Yugoslavian Civil War. In addition to the AKM, an underfolding version, of course, was adopted, similar to the original AKS. It is the AKMS, of course, same designator. And I apologize, I don't have a Russian one to really show you, but I have a couple others. So, in fact, I have a lot of underfolders, but they're all variations to some greater degree. In video 1, I referred you to this video for the AKS anyway, because here is my Warsaw 1063 underfolder. Now, while this is a AKM pattern gun, known in the Romanian military as the PM65, its original style of stock used was the AKS pattern. And by that I mean, this is made of machined steel, not stamped and riveted. See, it's rounded arms. We have a detent in the butt plate where it locks down. And we have no lock on this side for the stock. It's just a hinge over here, not hinge, excuse me when I was saying, a pivot. The lock is only on the left side where the button's at here. You can see the lock here. So the original AKS pattern stock only locked on the left side where the button's at. It also has this very distinctive down sweep to the angle of it all. Now this was the version of stock that Russia used on their mill guns. When they went to the stamped, they went to the AKMS pattern, which we'll look at in just a second. For whatever reason, Romania kept this stock when it built its PM65. In fact, some have speculated that the early stocks, such as this one, were actually Russian, sent over to Romania. So perhaps they just got a good deal on these because they were leftover stock that Izhevsk didn't need. So who knows? Now later Romania would go to a simplified version that was machined, and then they would finally go to a completely tubular stamped version, which is actually pretty unique. But all three versions of the Romanian underfolding stock only lock on the one side. And this, as you can tell, is very similar to the stock on the German MP40. So when Kalashnikov made his prototypes way back in the 40s, he definitely looked at the MP40 folding stock. That said, back then there weren't a heck of a lot of different underfolding stocks to take inspiration from. So, yeah, whatever. Now, the PM65 is again a very close copy, such as the PM63 otherwise, except for the stock. The big difference is we have a dong. This was added in, again, the late 60s. The earliest guns just had palm-swell handguards. This dong is a little bit shorter and it's swept back so the stock can clear it. And I actually find this to be very interesting and comfortable to grip. It's an interesting gun to handle. I can finally show you the AKM bayonet fitting because this is a, if I forget where I stuck it. This is a gun that was imported after 2004, so they were allowed to have a bayonet on it. This actually locks on to the gas block here. And so it attaches in the rear, and then it has a traditional muzzle ring. It's also a shorter bayonet with serrations on the bottom for cutting. And along with the scabbard here, this end, if you connect them together, it's also a wire cutter. And in fact, on this one, we have the rubber insulating boot. So if it's electrical wire, hopefully you won't get shocked. But that is the AKM style bayonet. Otherwise, the Romanian is the same. Moving along, we have another AKS type here. This is one probably more you have seen. This is the Polish PMKS, often just called the Polish AKMS. This is basically an exact copy of a Russian Soviet AKS. This particular one is not an import. This was built from a matching kit with barrel by Allied Armament several years ago at the behest of Atlantic Firearms. So this is pretty much exactly like the MOD on all the details, except now we have the true AKMS folding stock with the second latch over here. This is made of squared off stamped steel with rivets to hold it together. This butt plate no longer has the clickable little detents. It just comes down on its own. We have the Polish Bakelite grip that's replaced the wood in the 60s. Typical Polish mag. Now this one's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's a later production, so it has the cast gas block. You can see the angle up here is quite different from the others. Beginning around 1970, 1971 in Russia, ISESK and a later Tula started to use some cast parts. These included the front sight base, the gas block, the handguard retainer, the rear sight base, but never the trunnion. I keep hammering that point home in different videos just so people understand. So they did do some economization, and this would be carried over to the later AK-74. In fact, late production AKMs from Russia would have a lot of the same basic features as early production AK-74s. Other countries would adopt some of these changes as well. Poland would probably do the most, and it would go to these cast parts in the mid-80s. I've seen 84, 85 mentioned as the beginning. Romania too would go to some cast parts. Now this is an original kit built by Kruger in modern times, rebuilt on a semi, so it still has the machined parts, but later production, newer production guns will have the cast, although they don't have that quite unique step to the almost 90-degree block like the Russian-Polish pattern. Bringing this one back up because of this magazine. Now, a lot of people are familiar with this color and style of mag. They call it Bakelite. It's actually an AG4 material. Most people are familiar with it from the AK-74 in 545x39, and it was definitely used in that. But it was actually first introduced in 1968 for the 7.62 39 AKM. This was yet more attempts to lighten up the load. This magazine is made of a synthetic material. We do have a metal skeleton with metal feed lips and steel locking tabs, so it's still quite strong. The base plate's still metal. If you recall, as I said earlier, the ribbed mags, like this one here, are about 3/4 of a pound. So lighter than the original stamped mags, but still relatively heavy. The alloy mags were about a 1/2 pound, a little under actually, more like 0.4 pounds, but very weak. These so-called Bakelite mags are about 1/2 pound, just a hair more, and quite a bit stronger. So these mags really combine the benefits of the waffle mag with the strength and durability of the ribbed pattern. So that's nice. These would be in production at Russia for quite a long time for both calibers once the AK-74 was introduced. They would actually keep making these until the early 80s. So they were in production not quite 15 years in Russia. Now that said, and I could be wrong on this, I probably am, but I haven't seen 7.62 39 Bakelite mags made by any other country. All the ones I've seen have either been Tula or Izhevsk, but again, if I'm wrong, please correct me. I know China made some export ones that were looking the same, but were actually more modern polymer. That's the closest I can think of. They also made a 40-round version, but we'll talk about that in the RPK video. Finally, they would go to a newer pattern of mag made out of a more first brown plum polymer, and then more recently an actual matte black. and it would weigh about the same, be a little more durable and flexible. So they've been continuously evolving this magazine for the AKM. Remember, the AKM is still, especially the AKMS, is still in service in Russia, even if in limited numbers. So they do keep modernizing them. You'll even see some with the more modern handguards. Although since production ended in the 70s, these would all be post-production retrofits. Yugoslavia would also do quite a few underfolding versions, including with a 1.0 stamped receiver as well as a 1.5. The 1.0 over there is known as the M70 AB1. The 1.5 is known as the M70 AB2. Hungary would do the AK-63D, as I said. This would pretty much be the only version I'm aware of that was made in Romania. If there's another variant, let me know, but I'm only aware of the PM65. China would do both a milled and a stamped underfolder, and a couple of different handguard types to go with. They would even do one with a folding bayonet and a folding stock, which is mostly made for export from what I've read, but Americans seem to really be attracted to it. Heck, even Finland would try doing an underfolder with the M70S. So, kind of interesting there. East Germany, just to catch up with those folks, would also pick up the AKM. If you remember, the original was called the MPI-K. The new version was called, at first, the MPI-KM for a fixed stock. Later, the MPI-KMS for the underfolder. And these would be pretty much exact copies, like this Polish here. The early ones would have wood handguards. Later they would go to plastic, and I do mean plastic, brown plastic furniture, buttstock on the fixed, or obviously metal on the folder, pistol grip, upper and lower handguard, but they found their brown plastic was melting on the lower handguard, so they switched back to a wood. It was either, I think it was a beech wood, because the early East German guns had beech wood. Later they would even go to the MPI M72, which is pretty analogous to the Romanian PM90. It would have the wire right side folding stock. It would also finally introduce a synthetic lower handguard made out of a more durable, harder, more heat resistant Bakelite style or AG4 style material, although it would still retain the brown plastic pistol grip and upper handguard. And I've got a MPI-KM build and a few other videos, so if you want to look at it, check it out. They're pretty distinctive with their pebble grain buttstocks. But East Germany would manufacture the heck out of those. They would start making them in the early to mid 60s, and they would keep making the 7.62 guns through the 80s. By the 80s, they had gone to the 5.45 cartridge for their own use, but they were making the 7.62 for export. East Germany was actually a big exporter of AK-type rifles. In fact, Finland purchased quite a few Chinese and East German guns after the end of communism in the late 80s, early 90s, and quite a few African, Middle Eastern nations, and so on and so forth. In fact, quite a few of the East German guns will turn up during the Yugoslavian Civil War, and the parts kits we've had come in over the last several years have all come out of the former Yugoslavia in one nation or another. So East Germany pretty much produced an exact copy, but with different furniture. It also used a slightly different sling, so it has an enlarged front sling loop. Other than that, it was just a high-quality copy. Well, that's the AKM. I hope that's kind of helped with its history a little bit. These really aren't being made much of anywhere anymore, except for maybe commercial sales and semi-automatic versions. Romania is still doing them. I do not believe Poland is, except by special order, but I believe Fabryka Bruni could make a gun, although they prefer to make guns in more the modern Baril pattern versus the traditional. There are those WB guns coming out of Poland, but I don't know a lot about them yet, so I don't want to speak to those. Hungary, FEG, has closed, so they're no longer making them. China is still making all kinds of things, but we really don't know what they're doing because of the sanctions that were put against China 23 years ago. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Finland's no longer making AKs. So we're pretty much, the AKs we have in the world are basically the ones we're going to have. There are still a few being made, but the AKM is basically history. So even though these are seeing a lot of combat use around the world, they're typically older guns that have been recycled time and time again. It is reliable, just like the original. This stamped receiver is lighter, but still every bit as durable as a milled. A lot of people ask me about that, and I say, have you ever heard of a stamped receiver gun failing or even getting bent? It's perfectly durable. Because of the, well, this one has the nut on it, but because of the sugar scoop and full auto, it is a little more controllable, and the palm swells help. Obviously the vertical grip would help on this one. So in a way, the Kalashnikov team at Izhevsk achieved their goals in the late 50s. They made a lighter, cheaper, faster to produce AK, and that's why it's stuck around for over half a century. These guns, because of all the stamped parts and riveting, are very cheap to produce individually, but to set up a production line is not cheap. Per unit, they're cheap, but manufacturing, I'm not saying they're expensive or time-consuming compared to some other guns out there today, but these are wood and steel guns compared to a lot of the more modern polymer guns. So the AK, by modern standards, is definitely not as cheap to produce as some of the others that are out there today. Well, that's about all I can ramble about this critter. Hope that has helped your historical questions, at least somewhat. But if you have more, please put them in the comments below, and if I can't answer them, which I'm sure I can't answer them all, someone else I bet will. There are plenty of very knowledgeable folks out there. If you liked the video, please click like. If you haven't checked out the other parts in this series, please do so if you have time. And if you haven't already subscribed, you know the deal. We'd really appreciate it if you would. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.